Hello, and welcome to the Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations podcast, where we take a deep dive into the craft and business of children's nonfiction featuring new release authors. I'm your host, Kirsten Larson, author of Reimagining Your Nonfiction Picture Book. Today, I am taking a deep dive into the topic of revision with the amazing Michelle Cusolito, who has not just one, but two new books out this year. Jellyfish Scientist, Maude, is it Delap?
Delap.
Delap, Maude Delap,
Maude Delap.
and her Mesmerizing Medusas, illustrated by Ellen Rooney from Charlesbridge, and In the World of Whales, illustrated by Sibert honoree Jessica Lanan from Neil Porter Books. She's also an adjunct instructor in Simmons University's MFA program. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a listener to your podcast, so I'm very excited to be here.
Yay. Well, and I have learned so much from you about the topic of revision. So I'm excited that we can talk about it today. But before we do, please introduce yourself and your books.
Well, as Kirsten said, I'm Michelle Cusolito, and I'm the author of now 5 books as of this year. The 2 books this year are over here for the people on YouTube. This is Jellyfish Scientist, Maude Delap and Her Mesmerizing Medusas, which is a true story about Maude, who back in 1899, well, from 1899 to 1900, was the first person ever to rear jellyfish through a complete life cycle. And that was a big deal because if you don't know, jellyfish go through metamorphosis the way frogs or butterflies do. And for a long time, scientists didn't even understand which stage went with which animal. They thought they were maybe different animals. And other people had tried to raise them in captivity and weren't successful, but Maude did it and went on to publish a paper in her own name, which was a really big deal in 1900. And my other book for the folks on YouTube over here, this one, In the World of Whales, is another true story about an experience of 2 men, really, who were free diving at the birth of a sperm whale. But the story is written from the perspective of one of those men. His name is Fred, and I chose one person because when the men told the story, when they tell the story, they each tell it as if they were alone in that experience. It was so transformative, and of course they're underwater, they can't speak to each other, so they each experienced it. It seemed to be like in a really individual way. So it's a true story about that experience of diving at the birth of a free diving at the birth of a sperm whale.
Well, and the thing that I find so fascinating is, I mean, they're both true stories, but they
Mhm.
are completely different books. So I know from some of our earlier discussions that both required a lot of revision. So, big picture question, how do
Mm.
you, as a creator, know when a book isn't quite there yet and there's still work to be done in terms of revision?
Yeah, it's a long process for me typically. Different books take different lengths of time. Jellyfish Scientist took me quite a long time to know. And unlike some people, I tend to keep my stuff really close to the chest for a long time. I work on it a lot by myself, sometimes before I even tell someone else I'm working on the idea, because I want to try to find my own way into what I'm doing. I want to be to do the best I can to bring it to life as I can see it in my head, but I maybe can't quite deliver it yet. And if I get too many people involved too early, I get too many voices in my head and I can't work with too many voices. So most of the time, I'm spending a long time on my own. And then I get to a point where someday I go, huh, I think this is pretty good. I wonder if this is good enough to send out on submission. I don't know. And then I have to call in my people. So I have a critique group. We've been meeting together for since I think 2008, slightly varying in members, but there are 4 of us now in this group who I don't know what I'd do without them. They're my go-to people for my critiques. And then I have a bunch of other people also who critique me who are more nonfiction specific people because my critique group, actually nobody in the group writes nonfiction, and they're all novelists. They write middle grade and YA, which might seem like a strange choice, but actually it works really well for us because they come to my work and say, I don't understand this. They don't know the science that I'm writing about. So they're a great barometer for this does not make sense. I don't understand things like that. So then I call in my helpers, my other critique people, and that's when I realize, oh, maybe it's not as great as I thought it was. I still need some work. And then I'll go back, and I often go through multiple rounds with various critiquers before it ever even goes to my agent. And then my agent will have notes. I've had one experience of him saying, "No notes." We joke about it because there's always notes.
Yeah, I don't think I know anybody that doesn't get notes most of the time, right?
Exactly,
I
exactly.
mean, you raise an interesting point because I think a lot of us working in nonfiction feel like our best readers are other people who love nonfiction. But I
Mm,
also feel like a lot of the reason that people come to nonfiction is we love facts and learning and information. And sometimes you can get a better read from somebody who isn't a nonfiction junkie because they don't have as much tolerance for all that backstory and context that may not be needed to get the story across. So it's really interesting that your
yes.
core group is not even a group of nonfiction junkies like us.
Yeah, exactly right. I go to different people for different sorts of feedback, you know. So my critique group, those folks are, like you said, are really great for helping me understand where there are things that maybe aren't on the page because maybe they're not as rooted in science. Well, they aren't as rooted in science information as some of my other readers. And so they'll tell me when things are confusing, you know. So there's a lot of that which is really helpful to me. I go to them and say, "What don't you understand?" or whatever. I ask very specific questions when I that's another thing I do when I send my work for critique. I set them up for what kind of feedback I'm looking for. And this is something I encourage everybody to do in my teaching at Simmons. They're asked to do that for workshop every week. Sort of, where am I in the process? How much have I worked it? And what kind of feedback am I seeking? And sometimes it's like, "I don't think this ending is working. Can you help?" Or sometimes it's more specific, like, "Give me all your line edits. I think it's ready to go. What have you got?" You know, I really try to guide people for what I need for feedback, which helps get what I need, but also discourages the notes that I just don't want to hear because it's not, maybe I'm not willing to make that change or whatever the thing is. My voice note, my internal voice knows I have this part down already, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, and also, I think when we're sending something out for critique, people feel compelled to give notes on something. So if we haven't given them an idea of here's where I'm really looking for feedback, they're going to try to find something, even if it's
Right.
something that to you is not unhelpful. So I actually have a similar, I have a similar process, which is normally at the top of a manuscript. I'll jot at least 3 or 4 things that I'm looking for
Yeah.
to shape the feedback that I need. And I also say I'm open to other things, but this is really where I need you to have a look because I'm not sure.
Yes, exactly, exactly right. And I often pose it in the form of a question, like these are my questions. I did one time send something to critique group that was really quite new, and I thought I was onto something interesting, but I wasn't confident, 100% confident in the voice. This goes back many years now, and that manuscript has never actually sold. But I sent it out practically first draft, I think, and I said, "What do you think of this voice? Like, I don't want any other notes. This is literally my first draft. I just want to know if this voice is compelling to you." And then I got back the feedback like, "Oh yeah, we love it." So then I could go on and work with that basic idea that I had.
Yeah, which, to that point, we can get feedback on our work at any stage. I mean, even if
Right.
it's just concept, working from kind of more of a pitch where we're sort of forming a concept, obviously you're getting different types of feedback.
So in addition to putting my questions at the top, one of or having people put questions at the top, one of the things I ask my students to do also in my class where I teach, I ask them to only give the feedback they've been asked for. So if someone didn't ask for line edits, you should not be giving line edits, for example. The only kind of feedback I want them to give that was not solicited was when they have compliments. So compliments are always welcome, but critical feedback should only be related to the questions that are asked or the guidance given by the author of that piece. So that's something I think is important to give to let the author have ownership of what are they looking for and how do you give the feedback that they want that they need that will be most useful to them.
Yeah, and I think another part, this is kind of like Liz Lerman's, what is it, critical response theory. I think she has some
Hmm.
writing about this. Another big question is, are you open to brainstorming and suggestions and ideas? Sometimes as authors, we just want somebody to pinpoint a problem, pinpoint an area of confusion, we don't necessarily want input on, and here's how you can fix it. But if you're up for suggestions, that's a good thing to know. But also being clear about whether you want that sort of input can be helpful too.
Yes, that is very, very true because lots of people want to start making suggestions for things to do, and then that becomes their piece of writing, not yours anymore. And I actually, in my MFA class, the student, the author of the piece, controls how the workshop portion goes. So I keep track of time, but they say, reminder, here's what I'm looking for, or since I posted it, I have a new question too. And then people give feedback, and I do not make my students sit quietly. Like that's some rule that some people do, and I feel like no, that's not useful. The person who's receiving feedback can't is not allowed to defend it. You're not allowed to engage in a like, well, this is why I did it. But sometimes it's really helpful to say, oh, oh, you didn't understand that da 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 is what I meant. And they can go, right, no, oh, wait, I didn't get that. Or, the author can ask a question that helps them better understand where the disconnect was between the reader and what was on the page. So I encourage the students to engage with each other during the process too, which is not how a lot of workshops are run. Often people are told you can't talk, and there's value to that because there's no point in arguing with someone's feedback. That's not helpful. I want the author to control what do they need. I want them to leave that workshop feeling excited to go back to the page. And how do we get there?
Right. And if your critique group is not meeting live or over Zoom, you can replicate some of this by putting information at the top of your manuscript about what sort of feedback is helpful, what questions you have, what you want people to read for, and whether or not you want suggestions for things that they find, or if you just want to hear the areas, that need
Yes.
improvement.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
But all of that comes into this idea of revision. And I know,
Yeah.
finding fresh ways into picture book biographies is especially challenging. You have taken a really innovative approach with the way that you structured Jellyfish Scientist. It's almost like you've taken pages from Maude science notebooks. Each page is labeled with the date, the day number of her experiment as she tries to raise jellyfish through this whole life cycle. And then there are illustrations that show her notebook. Ellen Rooney has incorporated those in the
Yeah.
illustrations, and you reference her making notes in the text. So it's kind of a walk through a scientist working in their science notebook. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the approaches that you tried with this story before you found the right way in? And how did you finally land on this sort of science notebook structure?
Yeah, I had to go back and look at my notes because this book was many years in the making. So I first learned about Maude in 2016. I started researching her in 2017 when I was still living in Ireland. That's when I learned about her. So I did a bunch of on the ground research there. I didn't write the first draft until March of 2020. You may remember it was lockdown. I was like,
Right.
well,
What
I'm
else are
going
we
to do this
doing?
now. Yep. And so I wrote a first draft, which I actually opened up that file and looked at it. And it's so bad. I'm going to read you the old opening.
Oh,
It
yay.
says, Maud stood at the ocean's edge in her floor length Victorian skirt. X years out of fashion. I couldn't remember the year, how many years out of fashion it was. Perhaps the hem dipped into the water on that late June day as she bent down to pluck an injured compass jellyfish from the water. Maud regularly walked along the shore and rowed out into the Valencia harbor and on and on. It's a lot of telling, like just I'm telling you things. I'm not putting things in scene. This is how I had to find my way in. I had to try to figure out for a long time. I puzzled with the fact that I love Maude and I wanted to tell about Maude and who she was as a person. And it's like, I can't tell all this much about Maude. I need to distill it down into something that makes sense in picture book form. So then I around about by the that's so about by February of the next year, February of 21, I had shifted to something closer to what it is now, but at that point it said June as a heading. Then it said the next day, then it said 6 days later. And in February of 21, I see a marginal note to myself that says, change this to be the dates, like the
Ah,
dates of the thing. Because I knew that from her published paper. She wrote all those dates in her published paper. So I made the note to myself, but then it didn't happen for almost a year. And the reason for that is I was working on A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone, 24 Days of Science at Sea. I was on deadline. And I found out in February of 2021, I'm going to sea. I need to prepare to go to sea. Then I was gone for 5.5 weeks. And then I had a writing deadline. So Maude had to wait. And I
right.
sat terrified somebody else would write about her before I finished.
Don't we all?
So then the following January of 22, as soon as I had sent my draft to my editor for A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone, I went back to Maude. And that's when I really broke it down into that logbook style. And I know for sure now by looking back, my book, A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone, and Maude and Jellyfish Scientist are in conversation with each other because in Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone, I use a logbook format. I documented day by day what it was like being at sea. And I don't actually recall which one happened first, but they both came together around the same time that I used that approach in these two books. They're wildly different books. A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone is for middle school readers. It's a much longer book, but that approach of logbook is used in both. So,
Well, and I think that's what's so fascinating because everything we write, whether it's published or not published, like you said, it's in conversation with other things that we're working on and they inform each other. And sometimes you can get a breakthrough, working on another piece of writing that you never would have imagined had you not been working on this middle grade. So that's pretty
yeah,
amazing.
exactly, exactly. And one other thing I wanted to mention is even once the manuscript I felt was ready and it went out on submission, it went to Karen Boss, my editor of my first two books, who wanted to buy it, but she came back to my agent and said, I'd like to make an offer on this, but first I want to make sure, is Michelle going to be willing to cut 250 words from the manuscript before we, right? So it ended up being, I think it ended up at about 850. I think it was around 1100 words in the version that went to her. I should have looked those numbers up. That's about right.
Right.
Um, and she said because she wanted to know before she made an offer, but she already knew me and she knows me as a reviser and how much I'm willing to get in there. And I was like, of course I'll cut 250 words. And I'm thinking, I don't know which words that'll be yet, but I know I can do it with Karen's guidance. And so that happened after it was already sold.
Right. Always say yes to that opportunity as long as, I mean, clearly you all shared a vision for the book, which is the most
Yes.
important thing. And so then
Yes.
it's a matter of, okay, I can cut words to bring this vision to life.
Yes. We shared a vision and we'd worked together on two other books at that point, and we're in the process of a third one. So I already knew we worked great together. I love working with Karen Boss. And part of what we cut out ended up on the end papers. So there was a lot more description of the life cycle of jellyfish in the main text, but now it's on the end papers.
I have the book here for the YouTube audience. I'll
Oh,
try to hold it up. But I do encourage everybody to get this book. I can't tell if I'm getting tangled
yep,
up
you've
in
got it
my
perfectly there. You can see the jellies. The bottom left is the bottom's the polyp stage. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, it's an amazing book. It's the visuals, the illustrations that Ellen's done. It's absolutely beautiful. So,
Yes.
all right. So, kind of on the other end of the spectrum of picture books, we have In the World of Whales. Even though this is one man's experience, you have not written this as a picture book biography, which in the hands of
Mhm.
another writer, it may have become more of a biography. But to me, In the World of Whales is just trademark Michelle Cusolito. So you're really inviting the reader in to travel under the waves alongside this free diver, witnessing the birth of this sperm whale calf. You have this beautiful lyrical language. It's achingly beautiful. I told Michelle before we came on that I was tearing up by the end of it. I challenge any of you to read this book and not get teary eyed. Um, so, talk to me about this. Some people may have told this as a picture book biography of a free diver. What led you to try a different approach that's more of a kind of a snapshot in time, a single experience?
Yeah, it was always clear right from the beginning that that was how I would do it. But I will say, Fred Bui, the person who is the main focus, the main person I focus on, he's a really interesting person. I could write a biography of him. He used to be a competitive free diver. Then he transitioned to being an underwater photographer, photographing free divers. But now he works in conservation photography and he works with a bunch of scientists, free diving and tagging sharks and all sorts of super cool things. But really, I wanted to write about this experience, which I learned about when I was writing my book, Diving Deep. There's a Diving Deep talks about different ways humans access the ocean. And kind of as you go through the book, each page brings you deeper and deeper down. And I read an entire book about free diving to write 2 pages about free diving in my book. And I also listened to a podcast where I heard the story of this experience, and I immediately was like, I have to write that. I have to write that. I had chills from the moment I heard it, and I grew up here in southeastern Massachusetts. I grew up going to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I know the long history of humans, not so great interactions, terrible interactions. I shouldn't say not so great, terrible interactions with sperm whales. And I just was so overcome by the beauty of the two kinds of mammals coming together in this beautiful story. So I always knew I would tell it this way. There was never a question in my mind that I would tell it just this event, not a biography. That's what I mean to say.
Yeah, that choice, the idea of kind of shining a light on this, as you said, a beautiful interaction between humans and whales when the history of humans and whaling is not, is horrible. Um,
Yeah.
I think that was a really effective choice. I think by if you had chosen to tell it as a more of a biography, you would have cluttered up the narrative with all these amazing things about Fred because he does sound like a
Yeah.
really cool guy, but then it's
Yeah.
kind of taking away from what you're trying to say about conservation and protecting other species and our duty as humans to help take care of these other creatures. So I know in some of our conversations preparing for this podcast, you shared that you had a pretty great revision story related to In the World of Whales. So can you
Yeah.
share that with our listeners now?
Yeah. So we're back to A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone plays a role here. I was on deadline. So I had finished Diving Deep, was already out or coming out, and I was on deadline for A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone. But I knew the story about those whales and Fred, and I wanted to write about them, but I was like, I can't. I'm on a deadline. But I woke up one morning and I was like, oh, I know how to write it. So before I got out of bed, I reached for my notebook. I just wrote it longhand, start to finish, wrote a first draft. Like just flew off my hands. And I hadn't even really fully researched it yet. I had only that basic knowledge from the podcast where I had heard someone else relate Fred's story. It was a secondhand account. I needed to do a lot of research after what I'm about to say. Anyway, wrote that first draft. Okay, great, brain. Done with that. Good. Go back, finish you're on deadline. Woke up the next morning, Tuesday morning. No, I know how to do it. Not that way. This way. Same story. Get the notebook. First start fresh, whole new draft, start to finish. Okay, brain, I'm all done. Yay. Go back to working on A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone. You know what's happening to happen now, right?
Right.
Day 3. I've got it. And it's really tricky to try to like don't chase the shiny new idea when you're in the trenches on a book, but I was like I can feel this is not that. It's something my brain is help I got to do it. What I did on that third day is I typed up the draft from the first day. I typed up the draft from the second day. Each of them had something good in it. I printed them out, large fonts, only single sided printing. And then I took them to my kitchen counter and I cut apart sections of it. And you've heard me talk about this magnetic
Yes.
poetry style approach I use. I have other stories related to this, but in this case, same thing. It's kind of like magnetic poetry, if you know what that is. I cut it apart kind of into scenes or sections, things that stayed together. I didn't cut every word apart. And I spread it all out on my counter and just started reading everything separate from each other. And I could very quickly be like, well, that's not great. And I would literally physically push away the words that I didn't want to use. Because this is something that bogs me down sometimes. I tend to write longhand for my first drafts. And if I'm still looking at those words, it's hard to let them go sometimes because I'm like, oh, but that's kind of good. So I literally physically pushed away the stuff I didn't want and just started moving around things like, how is this structure going to work? And maybe I could make this a repetitive phrase, or maybe this, I don't know. And it was very short amount of time. I want to say a half an hour, maybe it was an hour. I don't know. I was in flow state. I don't know how long. I had all these things lined up on my counter. I physically took the ones I'd pushed away and I crunched them up and I threw them away. And then I got some pieces of paper and I taped those others down in order the way I wanted them. And then I was able to go and take that and make that become a draft in my computer, like the actual draft that would become my working draft once I went back to it after I finished the book I had to finish. Um, and, the way it came out is very close to the way it is without I hadn't done any wordsmithing or anything like that.
Right.
There's a lot that changed, but the structure was there. The ideas were all there. It was like the best first draft I ever had. Technically the third one, but they kind of feel like all one to me. And I was like, this is great. And then really my brain was like, okay, it's good. That's good. And I left it and I went back and worked on A Window into the Ocean Twilight Zone and I finished it. Um,
Well, and I will put a link in the show notes to a blog post that you have from 2019, which sort of talks about this approach that
yes.
you
Yes.
use, where you're kind of letting the best words, the best scenes, the best moments bubble up to the top. But I'm the same way. I feel like once the structure's in place, I mean, that to me is always the hardest part is the approach, the structure and the approach. How am I going to tell this story? Then when you're down to the line level, wordsmithing, to me, it's a little bit easier. But I
Yeah.
love that technique. A lot of times if you can give your brain a way to see things in a new way, if you're that tactile experience of cutting things
Yes.
out. I mean, I think it just causes like a shift in your brain.
Yes, and that blog post you mentioned, that one was written about writing diving deep, and that was one I was struggling with, and that I ended up doing a funny mashup of this magnetic poetry approach and making a picture book dummy, where I figured out the beginning and the ending, but like what's the middle? So I made a dummy and stuck down the beginning page, the beginning stuff, and then stuck down the ending, and like how much space do I have left? Okay, well, that's what I have to work with. Now I need to figure out what goes here. And so it's worked for me a lot before.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you obviously are a teacher of other
Mm.
authors. So do you have any revision techniques that you teach to your students besides, this magnetic poetry approach, or any other tips for
Mm.
our listeners who may be struggling to revise their own work?
Yeah, so my biggest tip for pretty much everybody is whenever you can, try to work analog. Get away from your computer and do something with your hands. There's a lot of research that backs this up, that working with your hand, even drafting with your hand, accesses a part of a brain. It lights up a part of your brain that's creative and it's different than the physical act of typing. I'm not saying don't type your work. I'm not saying that, but when I'm stuck, I sometimes resist printing because I'm an environmentally conscious person and I don't want to kill more trees, and I will delay stupid long sometimes printing something. Inevitably, the minute I print it, it already is better. Like when Diving Deep was being illustrated and we got some sketches back, something wasn't working. Like Nicole had brought a really interesting idea to the illustrations, but the text wasn't quite working. And so my editor, Karen, had suggested, I think this will work. And I'm like, no, that's not quite right. And I resisted and resisted and resisted till I finally printed the pages in question and printed that section of manuscript. And it literally was 5 minutes for me to solve the problem. And I
Wow.
just had to like cut the two spreads apart and reverse something and then take that text and move that text there. And that was the answer. It happened so fast. But another thing, you were talking about changing the way you see something. I have a manuscript that is out on submission right now. And I originally thought of writing it sort of in the same approach, kind of a verse style, like shorter lines down with a lot of line breaks down the page. And then I was like, I don't know, does it need to be that way? And I took all the line breaks out. And then I was working with it like that. And at a certain point, I could not make the ending work. Like the ending was dogging me for weeks. I got input from my critique group, from my nonfiction friends, from my agent, from my husband. Nothing was working. And then I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back in and make line breaks because line breaks really help me with wordsmithing. Um, because whatever lands at the end of a line is an important word.
Mhm.
It gives it weight when it's at the end of the line. And so when I started breaking things up, I'd be like, well, that's not a great word. Why'd I leave that word there? But when it was in the middle, I didn't notice it. So
Right.
I was able to word those line breaks helped me make the writing better. And then I found the ending, big surprise, because I was able to sort through things and get a better handle. And I was like, oh, this little bit should move up, and then this sentence is what I need for the ending. I was able to see it once I changed the line breaks. Sometimes I'll change the font size, the font color, what font I'm using. That can make me see things differently. So anything you can do to change it up and make your eye see it in a new way, I think is helpful too.
Well, and also going back to your idea of writing longhand, what I struggle with and what I see a lot of other writers struggling with, again, we love the facts. And so if you're typing, and most of us can probably type fairly quickly, it's really easy to put in way more facts than we need, a lot more context, backstory, things that the reader maybe doesn't really need to understand this particular moment in time. But if I
Right.
have to write it longhand, I'm going to think twice before I put that data dump in because that's a lot of handwriting and I'm going to get a hand cramp.
That is true. I don't think I've ever thought of that before, but that is true. While you were speaking, it reminded me of another strategy, which I referenced when I read that excerpt to you at the beginning, which
Mhm.
is when I can't retrieve a fact, I put X or XX in the spot, just a placeholder. Because when I'm drafting, I'm usually not looking at my materials. I've researched so much that I know the story, I know the information, but sometimes there's a factoid or like a date or something that I can't remember, and I know if I pause to go look for it, I'm out of the groove. I'm down a rabbit hole. I see some fact that I think, oh, I should put that fact in too. And I'm going to start doing what you just talked about. Oh, yeah, right. That fact, that fact. And then so if I mark it, I just go later. And sometimes that X will sit there through like 8, 10, 12 drafts. I still don't fix it because it's not the most important thing. And then sometimes I realize, oh, that's because I don't actually need that fact and I can just ditch it anyway. Like in this one I read to you, the fact that I read the X to you out loud, that's not in there anymore. It didn't
Ah,
stay. So I didn't waste the time finding the detail because I didn't need it because it didn't stay anyhow.
well, I do something very similar. In fact, I was just reading about Shonda Rhimes, and I guess she does something similar. Like when she's writing political shows, her placeholder is political for whatever like political issue they need to dump in there. Or on Grey's Anatomy, it was like
Medical,
medical.
medical.
And like,
Yeah.
I don't need to get into the what we're doing in the operating room right now because that's not really what it's about. So I'm just going to put the placeholder so we can focus on the characters and what's happening.
That's
uh,
great. And then her researchers are going to go help her find the facts that she needs too, right?
right.
Unlike us, we have to go find it ourselves.
I know, but that rabbit hole is deadly and it really can suck the life out of your story. So it's great if you can avoid the research rabbit hole when you don't need to be there.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
Oh my gosh, Michelle, this is so amazing. I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about revision and also working better with critique groups, which I think is another valuable kind of adjunct to revision. So, what is next for you that you can talk about?
I can. So I have a book coming out in March next year called Rooted in Wonder, Celebrating the World's National Trees, which
Oh,
people might be surprised and think, Michelle is writing about trees. What's going on there? That's not
yes.
her usual. But actually, anyone who knows me knows this is 100% in my wheelhouse. First of all, it's rooted in wonder, and that's very much that's the base of all of my work. That sense of wonder for the natural world. I basically live in a forest. I'm surrounded by forest. I walk in the woods all the time. I've always been drawn to trees. I hang a hammock in my tree outside here. So it's very much in line with me as a person, even though the content is a shift for people who maybe in the general world who don't know me. It's very much about like human connection to trees and why trees are important to us and to different countries, why they choose that tree as their national tree. So that will be coming out in March. And I have two things on submission that I can't really say, but
Of
two things on
course.
submission right now. And I'm actually at the moment having a conversation with another nonfiction author about a possible collaboration on a project. So we're kind of in the
Ooh,
beginning stages of that. Not for public sharing yet, I
of
guess. I hate to
course.
be vague.
Well, no, no. I mean, we have to be. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Um, well, so where can our listeners find you and your books online? Where's a good place to be in touch?
Yeah. So my website is michellecusolito.com. MICHELLECUSOLITO.com. And I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky at mcusolito, same handle. And if you're, I strongly encourage people to please, if you want to buy books, buy them from indie bookstores. A couple of my favorite indies are Titcomb's Bookshop, an Unlikely Story Bookshop here in Massachusetts, and Eight Cousins Bookshop is where you can go if you want signed copies. They always have signed copies of all of my books, and they ship anywhere across the country. So those are great places for indie bookstores. If you really want an online specific retailer, bookshop.org is my favorite for that.
Yeah, and I'm actually in the process of setting up a bookshop for the podcast where I'll have all the books,
Oh, great.
yeah, that we featured on the podcast too. So it's another great way to support indies with a portion of your sales. So,
Exactly. Exactly.
all right. Well, Michelle, you are amazing. I am so grateful that you were able to come on and share all your wisdom with our listeners. And I wish you all the best wherever your writing journey takes you next.
Thank you so much. And same to you. I love being here.
All right. Thanks. Bye bye. Thank you for listening. To get the full transcript of this podcast, sign up for my newsletter at KirstenWLarson.com. It will be sent out with the next mailing. All backlist episodes are available via the Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations page on my website. You can watch on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Are you enjoying the podcast? Please consider leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts to help more nonfiction lovers discover it. Join me next time when I speak to author Patricia Newman about her latest book, Sharks Unhooked. We'll discuss forging connections with teachers and librarians through conferences, including crafting presentation proposals, brainstorming topics, and how these presentations can lead to school visits. Until then.